When not on the road, the partying continued. Although they were never lovers, both Mercury and Everett spent night after night indulging in the pleasures of London's burgeoning gay club scene.
They had a good time. They knew how to have a good time. And they loved the nightlife. They both loved the nightlife.
It was the days when Heaven had just started, and Legends, and, you know, we'd go, oh, where should we go tonight? We'd go to Legends, then we'd go somewhere else. And we'd all end up back at Freddie's house till the early hours, and then stagger out, and I'd have to go to class the next day, ballet class.
What was it like? It was just amazing. I mean, we just swept through. It was sort of, when I look back on it, we were behaving very arrogantly and very grand. But, of course, as soon as any of the doormen saw Freddie and Kenny together, or even, you know, separately, they and their entourages were whisked through. It was a very privileged time.
Everett became a club creature. He was always in heaven or somewhere. He was a club person and a gay club place. It was really, I mean, that was the type of person he was. He never could do anything small. He could never do it a little bit, or he never, no happy medium with him. He was always over the top.
I mean, it was a very promiscuous time. It was really before, you know, it was properly known about AIDS. It was a deeply promiscuous time, and there was a nightclub then that had in the basement a room where you had to have the manager's permission to have the key, and it was known as the room where anything goes. It was certainly unprotected sex. It was obviously whatever form of sex you wanted to have. I think probably some pretty big names were in there as well. What I have been told is that virtually everybody who had a key to that room is dead.
By the late 1970s, Kenny Everett and Freddie Mercury's lifestyles were notorious in show business, but their excesses were about to come back and haunt them. During the early 1980s, recreational drug abuse and promiscuity were the norm in London's gay club scene. With the advent of AIDS, clubland became a dangerous place for regulars like Everett and Mercury.
Freddie and Kenny were in the front line. I mean, Earl's Court was the heaviest area of London for gay life, in terms of actually picking people up and taking people home and having adventures with strangers.
Freddie was more of a trawler. He was a bit of a lone ranger. Everett was a bit of a throw himself into it, and it's always in this fun, you know. Freddie was more of a stand and look what was on offer. I know there was a lot of intermingling and interchanging of boyfriends, and a lot of trouble started all there. And of course it was all down to them all being around pulling and drugging at the same time, and life became a very great mess for Everett.
As well as sexual excess, both men indulged in huge amounts of drug taking. By the early 1980s, Kenny Everett was spending £1,000 a week on his cocaine habit.
They got into cocaine, and I think it changes people into monsters. And Everett became a little monster, and Freddie a big monster, really. They were monsters at that time, all taking this awful drug that made them very nasty and do things that weren't very rational.
I mean, rock and roll would not survive without drugs. You cannot get tours the size of Queen tours or Elton tours or whatever, from one venue to another without some sort of drug. I mean, whether it be caffeine, and you'd be peeing coffee all day, but I'm sure it wasn't, but there had to be in order for the road crew and the artists to perform such incredible feats.
Freddie's choice of drug was cocaine. He wouldn't touch any of the others.
There was a dinner party at his house, and he passed around this little drugs buffet, and everybody could have what they wanted. I thought it was typically generous, because he was sharing it with all his guests who wanted it, but typically over the top.
Everett and Mercury's partying was at full swing when they met charismatic ex-Red Army officer Nikolai Grinovich, a man who was to change their lives forever.
Kenny said to me, I was on the dance floor in Heaven, and this Russian walked up to me and said, "You're the sexiest man in the club. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." And Kenny thought this was just about the most romantic thing that could possibly happen to anybody. And he did think that Nikolai was a dish.
Nikolai was apparently hugely attractive, very muscular, and Kenny Everett always went for very muscular people, and he was indeed a bodybuilder, and very charismatic. He would walk into a restaurant, and you know, his table would immediately be full of people. He'd be chatting up people, both sexes, to, you know, talking to people. He had great charisma, and really he worked his way around the stars of the day.
In a way, Nikolai was probably a good partner for him at the time, because I know sexually he turned Kenny on hugely. But I think Nikolai also had a pretty manipulative streak.
Kenny fell in love with Nikolai and moved in with him. But the relationship was not monogamous. Nikolai was also involved with a Spanish waiter called Pepe. In 1984, Everett decided to tell the press he was gay, declaring that 2 husbands were better than 1.
My phone rang and he went, I've done it, I've come out. He said, I'd just come out onto the pavement and I've just come out and told them all. Actually, he'd said 2 husbands are better than 1, which, you know, I mean, it's coming out and there's coming out, isn't there? He always had to be over the top with everything. So I said, well, you better come out here straight away and I'll give you a coming out party. And I threw him a coming out party in the country, and he came and stayed a few days because he couldn't face what might come of it.
He was in a ménage à trois with Nikolai, an ex-Russian soldier and bodybuilder, and a Spanish chap called Pepe. And Freddie Mercury joined them, and they became a bit of a foursome. They would announce themselves, as Everett would say, we're the new Fab Four, and they would camp it up.
There was 4 of them. The Fab Four, as they were called on numerous occasions. Nikolai, Pepe, Freddie Mercury, and Kenny.
Of the group, Nikolai was by far the most promiscuous.
I called him Old Nick. I thought he was the devil himself, really, because I knew he'd be the death of Everett, because he was the most promiscuous person in the world. I mean, anything that stood up, male or female, Nicholas, he was just a complete sex maniac. I wouldn't let my dog stand still long enough round him, quite frankly. You wouldn't be sure what he would be doing.
Freddie Mercury was also not immune to Nikolai's charms and became another of the Russians' lovers.
This is a tricky situation. I've only got myself to blame.
Freddie Mercury did have a relationship with Nikolai, Kenny Everett's friend and lover, and so they were linked in that rather curious way. The 2 of them were friends, but they did share a partner in common.
Despite the news of a new illness ravaging the American gay community, Mercury and Everett continued to party hard. Freddie, in particular, willfully ignored the warning signals.
I'd come back from New York, where this terrible new disease was claiming large numbers of gay people, and I said to him, have you altered your behavior in light of this information from New York? And he said, with a very theatrical arm gesture, he said, darling, my attitude is, fuck it. I'm doing everything with everybody.
The Fab Four's promiscuous lifestyle was a disaster waiting to happen.
I believe one of them went to New York and had unprotected sex and came back with infected, and of course infected the other 3.
In 1984, Nikolai tested HIV positive. A frightened Kenny Everett turned to his ex-wife Lee for support.
He broke the news to me that Nicholas was HIV positive. And I said to him, well, then you've got to go and have some tests. He said, no, I'd rather not know. And I remember he was walking, because we lived on the river and we were walking down by the river. He said, no, I'd rather not know. And I said, I think you should know, because if you know, then you know that you've got to take precautions with other people, and you've also got to look after yourself. You've got to do everything you can to preserve yourself. But he didn't want to go, and finally he did. I persuaded him to go, and he went to the doctors, and he was HIV positive, and he was very devastated.
Lee Everett has no doubt about how her ex-husband contracted the virus.
Nicholas was in everywhere and with everything. And of course that's how Everett got AIDS. Nicholas gave it him. And in actual fact, I think I went into mourning then. That was when I felt I lost him then.
I paid my dues.
Kenny Everett's illness put an additional strain on his friendship with Freddie Mercury, a friendship which had been slowly falling apart since the early 1980s.
Kenny turned round and was telling everybody that Freddie was always doing his drugs but never gave any to him. And that was wrong. And just things got blown totally out of proportion.
The big breakup came over a sort of na-nanny-na-na sort of situation, which was, you know, it's like, the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Who's been eating my porridge? And in fact, it was, who's been using my Coke?
That was just a couple of girls squabbling. They had a party tiff that went nasty, got nasty. And in fact, none of us was speaking to him there. He's the brat. Freddie did comment that if he saw Everett on fire at one side of the road, he wouldn't cross the road and pee on him to put it out.
Kenny Everett's increasingly bizarre behaviour continued to damage his friendship with Freddie Mercury. The maverick DJ also alienated his young fan base.
He was a strange mixture of naivety and enormous confidence and talent, but he could be very naive about the repercussions of what he did.
This naivety had led to a particularly ill-advised appearance at a young Conservative rally at Wembley in 1983.
Let's bomb Russia! Let's kick Michael Foot's stick away!
He told me he was horrified. He said it was like a Nuremberg rally. And some ill-advised soul asked Kenny to introduce Margaret Thatcher. So he went on and said, "Now it's time for Mega Chick. I was saying to her this morning, Margaret, that's no way to roll a joint." And they didn't report all this. People might have got the vague idea he wasn't serious. And I said to him, it'll be a millstone round your neck, this. He said, "No, tomorrow's fish and chip paper." And no, every journalist who ever interviewed him said, "What was all that, let's bomb Russia?" And it just began to haunt him.
In 1985, as Queen performed to millions of people around the world at Live Aid, Freddie Mercury's relationship with Kenny Everett was becoming increasingly distant. Everett had become an embarrassment, and few show business friends would be seen with him. Mercury was now in the company of new partner, Jim Hutton.
I was standing backstage watching them, and I mean, seriously, the hair was standing on my head with excitement, I suppose. And of course, watching the crowd as well, they went absolutely apeshit. And I suppose Queen being the professionals that they are, I mean, once they're in front of the crowd, I mean, they hammered it out. And I think it was the comment there that said, "You stole the show."
Everybody that does a performance, I mean, they like people to say that it's good or whatever, but I mean, this was like a very unique event, and to have, people say that we were so good in terms of all the creme de la creme of the music, that's quite an achievement. So I think it's something that sort of, well, definitely, it sort of injected some new fuel into our bodies.
A veteran of the club scene, Jim Hutton had long been admired by Freddie and was to become his last long-term partner. In true Mercury fashion, his chat-up line was quite outrageous.
He actually asked me how big my cock was. It was as simple as that. And I think my reply was, well, if you want to know, you have to find out. It was basically, I think, tongue-in-cheek, but it was also like this shock. Well, he was very brash. I mean, I think he was the sort of guy that if he fancies someone, he made no bones about it.
I suppose one of my things was really to keep Freddie's foot on the ground. There was none of all this lovey-dovey stuff, you know, there was none of that. I was terrified of it. Bit of a prude, I suppose. And I suppose in a way, Freddie respected that. You know, he obviously didn't want me to be jumping on top of him every few minutes in public or anything like that. I mean, he could do it. He could get away with it because he was Freddie Mercury.
Although committed to the relationship with Jim Hutton, Freddie was still indulging in adventures with strangers.
You'd hear whispers and gossip, and I suppose in many ways, yes, you do listen to it, but I've always been one to say, well, unless I see with my own eyes what's going on, I tend to ignore it. And of course, Freddie would go out, slip out every Saturday night and not go home the following morning.
Jim obviously had his own line in the sand that he was prepared to let Freddie go up to, but once he went beyond that, he would walk out on him. And I think it did Freddie the power of good for someone to do that to him. He wasn't used to it. Good for Jim.
Then came the bombshell. In 1987, Mercury's sexual past finally caught up with him. Like Kenny Everett, Freddie also discovered that he was HIV positive.